Hello, and welcome again to this episode of Asian World Podcast with Dr. Hawkins. On this episode, we explore a difficult issue that spawned out of British involvement in South Asia. When the British arrived in India, there was this beautiful period of assimilation in the 17th century. When the British arrived in India, they fell hopelessly and desperately in love with all things Indian. They absolutely loved it. If you go back and read the records from the time when the company arrives in South Asia, the British merchants love the art, and they love the culture, and they love the religion, and the land, and the sunsets, and the mythology, and the social customs, and the food, and virtually everything they encounter, the British absolutely love. As a matter of fact, after a brief exposure to India, many of the British merchants that lived in South Asia wanted to be Indian more than they wanted to be British. And so therefore, they start to dress like Rajas or like Mughals. They begin to speak indigenous languages. They live in indigenous houses. They ate local food and practiced local customs. But most importantly, they began to marry Indian women and often engaged in polygamous marriages. In these polygamous marriages, British merchants had biracial children, which they recognized and dearly loved. They gave them their names, they gave them inheritances, they gave them opportunities to get educated back in Great Britain and also to take positions in the company. As a matter of fact, there are still commissioned oil paintings of British merchants and their Mughal wives and their multiplicity of children, which they display proudly. It's this wonderful period of time of cultural hybridity, where being British or being Indian sort of melts into each other. And in fact, the British East India Company worked with and for the Mughal dynasty. They were given the Diwani, which was the opportunity to tax farm on behalf of the dynasty. And the dynasty worked for the British East India Company as well, mobilizing labor and developing cash crops. And it was kind of this symbiotic relationship between the two. Well, during this period of cultural hybridity, the British East India Company basically had two ironclad rules of British involvement in South Asia. Number one, do not mess with their religion. The British had kind of viewed India as being essentialized by the various religious traditions in the subcontinent. They felt like what essentially makes them Indian, in one case or another, is what religion they're devoted to, much more than race. And number two, don't mess with their domestic spaces. And this is always good policy. And what that means is don't get involved in their homes, don't get involved in their marriages, don't get involved in the way that they raise their children, don't get involved in the way that the clans are organized. For the most part, leave them alone. And if you leave them alone, we're going to have this great symbiotic relationship where the company felt they could make money. And to be fair, the Mughal dynasty felt that they could also take advantage of the company's presence to bolster their own power in a period of slight decline. However, this was not meant to last. By the beginning of the 19th century, British attitudes in India began to change for the worse. And there are three reasons that this happened. Number one, the more the company began to blend into Indian culture, the more uncomfortable Parliament, the Crown, and the British gentry became. And so the elites in Great Britain began to seek opportunities to control the company and to control interactions in the subcontinent. And so what we get is the Regulation Act of 1773. We also get Pitt's India Act of 1784. And Parliament and the Crown begin to unofficially nationalize the British East India Company. When they do this, in order to control commerce and culture in the subcontinent, they begin to establish surveillance and bureaucratic controls in India. They create a whole variety of bureaucratic layers, reporting, licenses. It allows for growing state mechanisms of economic and social control over British merchants, but consequently over Indians alike. And believe it or not, this is really the beginning of British imperialism in India. It's a slow bureaucratic creep of surveillance and control. Second, by the opening decades of the 19th century, there's an emerging divide among the world's inhabitants. As industrialism takes hold across the Western world, there's a great divergence between the industrial haves and the industrial have-nots. And I have said it before and I'll say it again, this is categorically the most disruptive event in human history. Industrialization changes everything about the human experience. And so those from industrialized countries suddenly find themselves in an accelerated world of innovation, of mobility, and of convenience. And more than anything else, those from industrialized countries find themselves surrounded by an ocean of industrially produced consumer items that offer variety and status. And so they live in a dynamic, rapidly changing, innovative world of mechanization and convenience. Let me put it this way. If I was to blindfold you and I was to put you on an airplane and fly you for many hours and drop you off in the middle of the jungles of Papua New Guinea, quickly you would have a few urgent concerns. Most of your immediate concerns would be material and technological. For example, when you were dropped off, you take the blindfold off and immediately you'd say, okay, how do I communicate? How do I get a message to you? I don't have a phone. And if you did, you wouldn't have a signal. How do I communicate with people to let them know I'm here and to let them know I need help? You wouldn't know how to get information. You wouldn't know how to effectively get from point A to point B except to walk. You would have concerns about shelter, about fresh clothing, about how to find and cook food. And let's say you even wandered around the jungle for a little while and you came across a little village deep in the recesses of the jungle. A few of your concerns might be addressed, but in the midst of that deprivation, your inability to communicate, your inability to travel, your inability to find the material items you're used to that are mass produced by industrialization, you might be tempted to say a politically incorrect word. You might be tempted to call your surroundings, or even the little village in which you find yourself, primitive. What's more, the idea of primitivism is not just a lack of things. The industrial divide is enhanced by new social and economic cultures inherent in these industrial societies. For example, once industrialization takes hold, people begin to think about radical forms of freedom and individualism. The right to move, the right to consume, the right to pursue individual fulfillment. All of these things enabled by new forms of mobility and consumption. We get the rise of things like personal privacy. We get concepts of commodified, segmented time. We live our lives according to schedules with places to be, and time has a monetary value. Therefore, those that don't share these same modern values are suddenly seen as inadequate. The great divide materially and in terms of consciousness between those that are experiencing industrialism and those that aren't seems vast and eventually seems intranscendable. And so you start to see a material and cultural segregation among colonizer and colonized, a new civilizational assessment of those that are modern and those that are primitive. And so more and more, the British, by the time we get to the 19th century, they begin to look around and they ask themselves, why us and not them? I mean, whereas before they wanted to live like Mughals, they wanted to live like Rajas, they wanted to live like the local inhabitants. Now they're asking themselves in this new era of industrialization, who wants to live like a primitive? Primitives have less convenient and more difficult lives. And so primitive becomes a marker of inferiority, which naturally has implications for judgments on intelligence, value, status, and eventually emerges into concepts of superiority and inferiority. And this is a dark moment for the British Raj in India. We start to see a divide between colonizer and colonized based on concepts of superiority and inferiority. And this merges kind of seamlessly into the third reason. By the time we get to the 19th century, Europeans are becoming more and more obsessed with the rudimentary origins of germ theory, sanitation, and identifying causes of disease. So again, if we're going to go back to my analogy, if I put you on a plane, I blindfold you, fly you across the world, drop you in the middle of the jungles of Papua New Guinea, you're going to have some material concerns. You're going to wonder about your clothes, your shelter, your communication, your mobility. But then you're going to have a couple of other much more urgent concerns. And anybody that's traveled abroad has had these concerns. First concern is, can I eat that? Can I drink that? Is it going to make me sick? Is it okay? What is it? How is it cooked? Who cooked it? And then if you do find something to eat or drink, you're going to have an immediate follow-up question. And that question is also universal to anybody that's traveled. Where can I poop? When I take my students on study abroad, these are often the most daily urgent concern when I take students abroad, is they wonder on a day-by-day basis, can I eat this? What is it? What part of the animal did it come from? How is it cooked? Who cooked it? Am I going to get sick from it? And even more urgent than that is as we're traveling in certain parts of the world, they also have deep fears of bathrooms. where they can go to the bathroom, the type of fixtures in the bathroom, the smell of the bathroom, the location of the bathroom, the cleanliness of the bathroom. And this is all valid. This is not a criticism. I've felt it. Everybody has felt it. But think critically for a minute. What are they afraid of? They're afraid of contamination, right? They're afraid of getting sick. They're afraid they're going to consume something or touch something that's going to cause them to get sick. At the beginning of the 19th century, the British begin to become obsessed with sanitation in India. And we start to see a great divergence in the way that the British dress, in the way that they live, in the way that they consume food, in the way that they pursue sanitation in particularly British areas. And the British begin to segregate themselves off from the local inhabitants because of this fundamental fear of contamination. And again, this is a big difference. Prior to this, the British are cohabitating, intermarrying, producing children, living in the way that the locals live. But by the 19th century, the British begin to dress in British clothing. They begin to live in British houses. They begin to consume British types of food because there is this fear of contamination. Now, as the fear of contamination grows, compounded by the fact that they begin to view Indians as sort of inadequately primitive, this is where it takes a turn into even darker forms of what we would identify as modern racism. Because if now you're a British merchant in India in 1813, and you're concerned about sanitation, you're concerned about primitivism, you're concerned about maintaining a certain lifestyle associated with a more sanitary and industrial Europe, the question is, how do you identify a potential contaminant? Unfortunately, they're primarily identified by the way that their body looks, meaning tone of skin, color of hair, eye, and so forth. So it begins to morph into what we would recognize as classical clinical racism. But then it gets even a little bit worse. There's not just fears of biological contamination, there's fears of cultural contamination. The idea that if the British go to India and they sort of, in the words of the time, become native or go native, that they could somehow be compromised. They could fall back into old forms of tyranny and primitivism and could lose touch with the dynamic evolution that characterizes industrial modernity. And so it creates a kind of modernist cultural fundamentalism that they have to segregate away from Indians. They have to be different, not only on the basis of biological contamination, but cultural contamination. And this seems to be the underlying rationale for most of the racism that we see in the 19th and 20th century. I think it's fascinating to look at the United States' own history with racism and segregation. And even if you were to go to the South and look at some of the battles over segregation in the American South, look at where they took place. Lunch counters, bathrooms, drinking fountains, swimming pools. What do all these have in common? They're potential sites of contamination. And so this great fear, born out of modernity, industrialization, and sanitation regimes, seems to inform a lot of the racism of the 19th and 20th centuries. And so, unfortunately, in India, we start to see a great divide between the colonizer and the colonized. And so, whereas before the British considered India to be historic and magnificent and beautiful, now they began to deploy some new tropes to describe the region. And these are worth going through because it really sums up how the British are viewing India beginning in the 19th century. First and foremost, India is viewed as stagnant. Now, what I mean by that is the British viewed India as essentially stuck in time. What characterized industrial modernity more than anything was the fact that it was dynamic, it was evolutionary, meaning that modernity is essentially a series of transitions to higher and higher planes of modern achievement. And so when they looked at India, what they said is, you know what's wrong with India is that it's stuck in time. There's been no dynamic evolution, no innovation. What India was 10,000 years ago is essentially what India is today. And this is the reason for the great divergence. Second, the British begin to view India as archaic. Now, archaic is different than historic. Historic is good, right? I mean, the pyramids are historical. Archaic means old, but no longer adequate to the present. A VCR is archaic. There's no use for it. No one wants it anymore. It's inadequate to the present moment. And so the British began to characterize India as not only stagnant, but now archaic in an emerging modern world. It's no longer useful. So what do you do to archaic things? What do you do to VCRs? You got to scrap them. And you got to replace them with something new. Number 3, the British begin to view India as parochial. Now, this is a super important one for modernity because in the belief of the West, the modern mind is above all a rational mind. The modern mind systematically sets about dissecting, investigating, reaching conclusions, forming hypotheses, and discovering the world in a way that renders it useful for our collective advancement. And so being overly parochial is seen as antithetical to modernity. What I mean by that is effectively explaining the world through religious belief. So if something happens, rather than unpacking and systematically investigating, one is tempted to say, well, the gods, fate, the spirits, luck. And for modern Westerners, this is wholly unacceptable. They very much view it's hard to advance, it's hard to progress, and it's hard to innovate if one is too parochial. And even in the United States, they held these biases well into the 20th century. It was often felt by New England WASPs that Catholics were too parochial, which is why John F. Kennedy had a hard time getting elected, as they felt, well, Catholics aren't hyper-rational. They believe in all these superstitions and things like that. And Kennedy had to overcome those biases. And so this is a deeply embedded notion of modernity, that modernity is highly rational and not compatible with overly parochial cultures. Now, again, this is a big divergence from the past where the British were absolutely in love with the Vedas, and they were in love with the Bhagavad Gita, and they were in love with Sanskrit, and they were in love with the philosophy, and they thought that India was such an interesting and mystical place. And now by the 19th century, that all seems stagnant and archaic and parochial. Number 4, they begin to describe India as tyrannical. Now there's this idea that among primitives, they were inherently inclined to tyranny. That modernity is above all the era of the individual, self-determination, participatory government, a sense of personal fulfillment. Whereas they felt that primitive societies were ruled by tyrannical figures and submissive subjects. And so the British, whereas before they would share power and work with, the British East India Company would work with the Mughal dynasty, and the Mughal dynasty would work with the British, and there was kind of an interweaving between the two. Now the British begin to systematically divest Indians of power. And the assumption was, well, if you're primitive and you're tyrannical, you can't be trusted with authority over your fellow men or over your fellow humans, because you will exercise it unrighteously and you will naturally oppress, and you won't respect things like individual determinism and autonomy and privacy and all of the values that are held by modern industrial societies. Number 5, the British begin to view Indians as essentially infantile. And by that, I mean that the British begin to look at Indians as little children, people that need to be governed by a strong paternalistic hand, people that need to be guided through a kind of evolutionary cultural journey to adulthood, as one might parent a child. And this is going to play a huge part in what we talk about next. This kind of delusional notion that what they're doing is paternalistic and kind and necessary, but also creates a massive power asymmetry that facilitates horrible oppression. And finally, number 6, we already talked about this, so I won't belabor it, but they view India as unsanitary, potentially contaminating, both in terms of biological contamination and in terms of cultural contamination. But here's the interesting thing and the tragic thing about all this. As British fear and loathing increases by the 19th century, it provokes a kind of ironic reaction. The only thing that equals the British fear and loathing of India is an overwhelming desire to save India, a kind of moral compulsion to redeem India and bring it into the modern era. For the British, this becomes something known as the Civilizing Mission. And I always tell my students, the most cruelly ironic aspect of colonial history is that when empire becomes its darkest, its most cruel, its most oppressive, and its most inhumane, is when imperialists are deluded by a moral compulsion to save the colonized. Because if they're acting out of a delusional righteousness in which they become the saviors of the colonized peoples, well, at that point, then what's off limits? What line can't you cross? What boundary can't you break? If it's all in the act, ostensibly, of saving these people. I always tell my students, if imperialists ever happen to show up and they say, we're here to make some money, be cautious. If imperialists ever show up and they say, hey, good news, we're here to civilize you, grab everything and everyone you love and run. Don't look back. Because life is about to get dark and difficult and sinister and oppressive. And that's exactly what happens in South Asia. And so the British, by the time we get to the early 19th century, are dead set on civilizing, uplifting, and redeeming India, to educate and fumigate and inoculate and save India from one end to the other. But this also presents an interesting moment for the British. If the British come in deluded on this notion of righteousness and superiority, the immediate question is how to civilize. I mean, how do you go about civilizing a society? Well, I'm sure you're thinking of a number of things. I mean, most people say, well, the elites, right? Convert the elites and the rest of the people will follow. There's some effort at this. However, this proves difficult for the British because the elites are used as subsidiaries to facilitate empire. And their authority is derived from their traditions, their religion, their genealogy, the systems of government that were in existence prior to the arrival of the British. The other problem is elites don't want to convert to modernity. They're vested in the system. Their privilege and authority and wealth are derived from the system that put them into power. And so rather than actually converting the elites, more times than not, the British will co-opt elites in India. And they're referred to as subsidiary allies. And they're really the ones that mobilize labor, facilitate cash crops, and enable the company to make money there. Other people might suggest, well, okay, if I'm going to civilize a society, then go to the children, right? Start with the younger generation, convert them to the ideas of modernity, and then the society is naturally going to trend that way. The British definitely do this, open up schools across India. The problem is twofold. Number one, how do you get the kids to school? There's tremendous resistance to getting kids into British schools. And the British were often angry about this because they would say, okay, you got to go bring your kid to school. This is very important. And people would say, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. My kid will go to school. No worries at all. And the kid never shows up. And then the British go back and say, you got to bring your kid to school. For sure, he'll be there. And then he doesn't show up. And so wherever they went, they kind of encountered this passive resistance. Now, the British naturally parlayed this into a colonial trope of duplicity, where they said, well, they're inherently liars, right? Every time we ask them to do something, they lie about it. When in reality, they're resisting. Right? They don't want to be co-opted by the imperial regime. The other problem is, even if the British are able to educate children, the children then go home and simply have the old traditions re-ingrained in them, unlearning anything the British might instill in schools. And so it's definitely pursued throughout the colonial era. I have this great photo of a boys' school at Tarntaran where they're trying to educate these boys. It's really tragic. It was a policy, of course, of colonizers across the world to take children and put them into schools where they could be assimilated. But this was not tremendously successful. Others might suggest evangelization, right? Get the missionaries over there, convert them to Christianity or some Western form of it, and then naturally the values will flow. This presents a double problem for the British in India. Even though missionaries arrive after 1813, the British have already essentialized the Indian people relative to their religion. That's essentially what makes them Indian in the eyes of the British. And religions in South Asia are deeply, deeply ingrained and not easily uprooted. The British also try other things like bureaucratic regulation, access to markets, incentives from the company, labor, a variety of different things, all with moderate success. But then finally they figure out, if you really want to civilize a society, if you really want to fundamentally change it, then you have to go to the site of biological and cultural reproduction. Now, we have this weird thing where we take for granted that Thai people come from Thailand, and Filipinos come from the Philippines, and German people come from Germany. And while this is true, I guess, on a macro sense, when a person is born in Thailand or in the Philippines or in Germany, they don't essentially become German. They're not born essentially German. Every culture, every society, every ethnicity in every country has to be born again and again and again, a billion times a day, over and over. It's a constant process of creation. And if that process is interrupted in any way, then cultures and societies fade quicker than we might think. You have to go to this necessary and critical site of biological and cultural production and reproduction. And that site is a woman. That's where cultures are made. Every minute of every day, a billion times. Women bear biologically the next generation of Thais or Filipinos or Germans or Italians or whatever it might be. And from the moment they're born, historically, women have instilled the cultural practices and values and taboos into their children. And so if you essentially want to civilize a society, if you essentially want to remake a society, that's where you have to go. Everything else is just surface level. Women are where culture and values are transmitted and sustained over and over and over again. By the 19th century, the British figured this out. And so the British began to aggressively intervene in domestic spaces, which is a direct transgression of earlier policy. But they realize this is the line we have to cross. We have to get involved in their domestic spaces. When they do, they begin to deploy an incredibly paternalistic form of empire, essentially becoming a father figure in Indian homes saying, look, you're living an inadequate, deprived existence. You could have better. If you give us a chance, let us educate you, let us educate your children. Let us bring you the light and convenience and knowledge and material items of modernity. And so the British view themselves as being incredibly paternalistic, very fatherly, right? Coming in and rescuing the most vulnerable. But by doing so, this produces a devastating consequence, and one that has characterized empire across the world in the 19th and 20th centuries. Something called emasculation. And if you don't know what emasculation is when a man feels less like a man, particularly in the eyes of those that are most important to him. Let me put it like this. Now, this is just an analogy. Don't go do this. I would never go do this. Just for purposes here, this is an analogy. Everybody understand that. But if you're a guy, you know the best way to get into a fight, right? Let's say you just want to scrap. You know the best way to do it? Go into a bar, go into a club, find the toughest guy in there, go up to his girlfriend or his wife, put your arm around her waist, pull her in real close and say, don't worry, honey. You got a real man now. And you're going to have a fight. I guarantee it. Now think about it. Why would that instantly provoke a fight with someone? What if I came in the bar or the club and I go, hey buddy, I saw your car in the parking lot. Yeah, it's a real piece of crap. He would look at me confused. He would say, okay, that's not nice. Or it wouldn't provoke this immediate violent reaction. Why does that immediately provoke violence? The reason is emasculation. I made him look and feel like less of a man by positing myself as a better masculine opportunity for her right in front of him. Well, this is essentially what British imperialists do in the 19th century. The British imperialists effectively intervene in Indian domestic spaces and in a variety of different ways, essentially tell Indian women and children, don't worry, you got a real man now, right? This guy here, he's inadequate. He's not providing for you materially. He's parochial. He's tyrannical. He is inadequate to what you need. We, on the other hand, have all of the modern masculine traits we can provide, we can protect, and we do it better than him. Necessarily, it produces horrific emasculation. But of course, empire is characterized by asymmetries of power. The British are able to do this because of military, economic, social, and cultural power. And so just, again, it's just an analogy. But let's say I do that, put my arm around her, pull her up real close and say, don't worry, honey, you got a real man now. And he comes to knock my teeth out, but I pull out a gun, right? Which again, sort of would represent the asymmetry of power that the British have. I pull out my gun, I point at him, look at this guy. What'd I tell you? He's an animal, right? He immediately goes to violence. I'm just here. I'm trying to take care of you. I see value in you. And this guy goes from zero to crazy. This is nuts. And everybody looks on, and everybody sees that he is impotent to stop me. And in the midst of it, I look at the girl and I say, my gosh, this is worse than I thought. I'm really sorry. I didn't know it was this bad. You know what? This looks so bad that I think I need to check up on you tomorrow. I think I need to drop by. I think I need to make sure that everything's okay. All right. So I'll tell you what, I'll be by tomorrow and I'm going to check out how things are. Okay. Man, it's crazy. All right. Look, you guys can go. Okay. I'm just looking out for her. And so the girl and her guy, they leave. Now, what happens next? And this is critical to understand. What happens next? I get a lot of students that are like, oh, well, he gets his crew. They come by and they smoke you, right? That's not what happens, okay? Because given our metaphor here, given our analogy, I'm the only one that has a gun, okay? So I have the power of empire. Does he resign to what happened? Does he admit, yeah, I guess he is better able to take care and protect? No, that's not what happens. He can't stop me. What does he do next? He takes it out on her. He gets in the car and he slams the door and he looks over her and he says, how could you let that happen? How could you do that to me? Me, in front of everybody. Why didn't you spit in his face? Why didn't you slap him? Why didn't you tell him how great I was? Okay, I'll tell you this. We are never going out again. No. We're staying home. And I want to know where you're at. I want to know who you're with. I want your phone. I want to see your phone. Okay? And so as a result of this emasculating experience, he squeezes her a little tighter. And he disciplines her a little more severely. And he instills a little more fear in her. Well, naturally, the next day I go to check, see how she is. When I show up, she looks scared. He looks angry. I'm concerned. My concern justifies further intervention in my own mind. I need to come into the house. I need to see how he's been treating you. Do you have enough food? Is the heat on in here? My gosh, it's way worse than I thought. And so it begins to produce a cycle down. The more I intervene, the tighter he squeezes her. The more he disciplines her. The tighter he squeezes, the more I feel justified in intervening. And so on and on and on it goes. And this is typical to colonialism across the world in the 19th and 20th century. What we get is a paternalistic intervention into domestic spaces, emasculation. As a result, misogyny and abuse, justifying further intervention, further emasculation, further misogyny, further abuse, and down and down and down the cycle goes. Now in India, this ultimately reaches its apex in a strange case of something called Sati. Now, Sati, if you don't know what it is the ritualistic self-immolation of a widow by casting herself onto her late husband's funeral pyre. So it is a ritual where a woman will throw herself onto the fire that's cremating her husband and she'll burn alive with him. There are mentions as early as 300 BC. It's actually Greek, I think, that makes the mention of it. There's some suggestion that it harkens back to a Hindu legend involving a woman named Sati, one of Shiva's wives. And in the story, she's shamed by her father. And as a result, she self-immolates and is reincarnated as Parvati, another wife of Shiva and the sort of perfect embodiment of womanhood and motherhood. And so in the Hindu lore, that's typically where it appears. More than likely, the ritual developed among Hindu Rajput clans sometime probably in the Middle Ages. At any rate, by the 19th century, the British seize on the issue with fanaticism. They are absolutely concerned with Sati. It seems to embody all of the colonial tropes that they developed about India with savagery and misogyny and tyranny and parochialism and stagnation all embodied in this one event, Sati. And so it becomes the epitome in the mind of the British of everything that's wrong with India. And therefore it becomes a blunt instrument to bludgeon Indians and their culture, thus justifying the civilizing mission. And so as a result, the British Raj began to implement a series of bans. When they do, this naturally, as we talked about, produces an emasculation. And so when the British try to outlaw it, immediately Indian men say, hey, no, you can't tell us what to do with our women. You can't tell us what to do with our religion. You know, who do you think you are? And if you go back and read the actual debate surrounding this, the Indian elites are shocked. And one of their most pointed arguments is they tell the British, well, why are you suddenly upset about this now? It's never bothered you before. But now suddenly you got to buck up your shorts about it. Explain to us why you want to suddenly control this now. And the British respond with all these colonial tropes of inferiority and savagery and so forth. So as a result, Indian men tell the British, we're going to do it more because you can't tell us what to do with our women or our culture. And so between 1815 and 1818, the number of incidences of Sati in Calcutta triples to more than 800. And to read the records at the time, they are horrific. And this is where empire becomes so confusing, is you read accounts of young girls who might have been married to an older man. The man dies. The women are doped up with opium. They're cast onto the funeral pyre. They come off a light, charred and smoking and blind, and they're pushed back onto the funeral pyre where they die. And it creates this odd moment in colonial history, whereas if you or I were a British imperialist at the time witnessing it, you would naturally say, we have to stop this. This can't be. I have to do something. But no one ever stops to think, why is this occurring in the first place? Why are we only noticing this now? And rarely do colonialists trace it back to the moments of intervention, emasculation, disruption of domestic spaces and culture, and necessary reaction. This eventually leads to the Bengal Sati regulation of 1829, and then a series of acts protecting women throughout the 19th century, protecting widows, protecting children. So from a Western perspective, the British Raj in the 19th century makes critical advances in women's rights in terms of basic protections and autonomy. But here's where we really need to pause and ponder this for a second. And it's worth exploring the nuance of these issues because they're exactly the same issues that we struggle with today. The question is, what happens when human rights are imposed through imperialism? And are Western values universal? When we say human rights, are we referring to a universal, culturally transcendent notion? Or are we talking about particular Western values of modernity that are deemed to be superior and therefore universal? Even more controversial, do wealthy industrialized countries have a moral obligation to bring values and modes of living to less developed parts of the world? It's difficult and cringy to think about. But this is the justification for so many interventions today. There's a great clip, and I encourage you to Google it. Maybe 8 years ago, Jimmy Carter went on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show, and he explains to Jon Stewart how he eradicates the guinea worm in sub-Saharan Africa. And when you watch it, you want to applaud. You say, this is fantastic. How many people did he spare? What great work he has done. But as Jimmy Carter explains, and I'm not calling Jimmy Carter an imperialist, but as he explains his efforts to eradicate the guinea worm, go back and listen to this podcast. Look at the colonial tropes of stagnation, archaic, parochial, infantile, unsanitary, and you go down the list and you check them off and see if they're there. Yet I'm sure that Jimmy Carter's organization and the people that do similar things would say, look, we're out saving lives. And this is what we're doing. These interventions are necessary, and we're making the world a better place. To be fair, the British imperialists were making the exact same argument in the 19th century. And so the question is, in our era of modernity and post-modernity, of sanitary regimes and technological advancement, of universal values of human rights and individuality and autonomy, can such things be imposed? Should they? Is there a moral mandate to, or is there a moral mandate against? Though the British Raj banned Sati almost 200 years ago, the issues have not changed one bit into the 21st century. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Asian World Podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, please see the link below. Also, please check out my publications and my recently produced audiobook, Making Moros, Imperial Historicism and American Military Rule in the Philippines Muslim South, available wherever audiobooks are sold. Thank you.